Hi, my name is Ndegwa Alex, an alumni of Strathmore Law School and currently working as a corporate lawyer in Nairobi. Well, with the outbreak and spread of the COVID-19 crisis, most businesses in Kenya are going to find themselves in uncharted territory. We've not had a virus that has of this particular magnitude with the effects and the consequences that we've seen on the global economy, and that is able to injure the global trade network as we have seen the COVID-19 crisis do. And therefore, all the business plans, all the business models, all the sort of models that businesses had come up with for their future performance are likely to be thrown out of the window, either in the short term, if not in the long term. However, there's definitely a good news and a silver lining in that the businesses that remain agile, the businesses that remain resilient are the ones who are going to be able to weather the storm and be able to recover from the injury to their bottom lines. And I think I really want to emphasize that part of that agility and part of that resilience is being able to understand your legal obligations during this particular period of the crisis, and understanding how to mitigate the potential liabilities that could accrue from the various legal obligations that we have. And I'm just going to highlight a number of issues that businesses should consider. Number one, and probably one of the most important, is on contractual obligations. At the heart of almost every single business are contracts with their suppliers, are contracts with manufacturers, are contracts with their customers, are contracts with distributors, and these contracts are more likely to be affected during this particular crisis, either because businesses are not going to be able to perform because of the various government measures, either because suppliers cannot be able to act on their obligations because of the various health measures and even self-help measures that they're going to take against this particular crisis. And the most important thing for a business to do right now is to review your contractual obligations. Are there certain financial obligations that you have? Payment of loans, payment of interest. Do you have certain maintenance agreements? Because there is likely going to be a hit on the economy. There's definitely going to be a hit on both your top line and bottom line. Is that going to result into a breach of certain financial obligations and duties that you owe to your lenders? However, there's a silver lining, and that silver lining lies at a boilerplate clause, which we call the force majeure clause. And just briefly, a force majeure clause is a clause that alters the rights and the obligations of contractual parties in the event that there's a supervening event. And this supervening event could be floods, earthquakes, and what we generally call acts of God. Now, whether the virus falls under the definition of acts of God is definitely something that is going to be litigated probably in the next decade after we see the virus gone. However, carefully drafted force majeure clauses in existing contracts that include either epidemics and pandemics are likely to be able to give relief to anyone who intends to rely on that force majeure clause if they are unable or they are not able to comply with their obligations under the contract. However, it is not a creature of common law, but a force majeure clause is a creature of contract, and the parties must have agreed that a pandemic or epidemic, depending on how the courts are going to interpret, fall within this force majeure clause. Now, there's definitely a common misconception that if you're going to invoke a force majeure clause, you are completely excused from performing, or it gives you the right to terminate. This still is hell-bent and based on the drafting of that force majeure clause. Contracts are creatures of contractual freedom. Parties are free to determine the contents and the terms of every single contract. And so if the parties did not agree for pandemics and epidemics to be part of the force majeure clause, then as a business seeking to rely on those force majeure clause, you may unlikely be able to be shielded from liability. Now, so what should businesses do in light of this force majeure clause? One, review your force majeure clauses to ensure that pandemics are included. Two, if there are certain requirements for you to invoke the force majeure, for example, notification requirements, that 14 days you must give 14 days to your contractual counterparty, make sure that you do that. Three, for new contracts, ensure that your force majeure clauses include pandemics and epidemics, just to protect you and shield you from any contractual liability that may accrue. And last but not least, if you are likely to breach any other obligations under the contract due to the effects and consequences of the COVID-19 crisis, this is the time to communicate with the contractual counterparty, enter into variation agreements, and if the effects are too big, then you could even enter into novation agreements, just to ensure ensure that you minimize and mitigate any liabilities that may accrue. But the most important thing is reach out to your legal advisors and ensure that you shield yourself and understand the potential liabilities or the potential impact on your contractual obligations. Number 2, employment. At the heart of every single company or every single business are the employees who come to work to do the various aspects that move the business, that they interact with the suppliers and consumers and all the other counterparties that the business is engaged in on a day-to-day. Now, in Kenya, we have the Employment Act and we have several regulations. And maybe I'm just going to highlight maybe 3 things under the Employment Act that might likely be affected. Well, the COVID-19 crisis is likely to take a hit on the economy if it hasn't yet taken a hit on the economy. And consequently, it's definitely going to hit your revenues, your bottom line, your top line, whatnot. And in this particular instance, most businesses, if employees are going to stay home because of quarantine, if you have a government mandatory lockdown that requires employees to stay at home, it means that the productivity of the business is going to go down. It means that consumer demand is going to go down, and therefore businesses are not likely to generate the normal sales. But in that same, while still generating the low sales, they still have to pay their employees, either it's full pay or half pay. And most businesses are going to make the hard decision and the difficult decision of declaring redundancies and laying off employees. But it is important for every single business. If you are going to lay off employees, ensure that you comply with the provisions of the Employment Act. There's a set out procedure, so have valid reasons and follow the correct procedure. And there are a number of case laws that have outlined and interpreted these particular procedures. If your employees are unionized and there's a recognized collective bargaining agreement, ensure that you not only follow the provisions of the Act, but also comply with the provisions of the CBA in declaring the redundancies and in sending the employees home. Number 2, workplace safety. The Occupational Safety and Health Act, OSHA, requires every single employer to ensure that their employees are safe at work. If your employees are still coming to work or you are maintaining a particular skeleton team, make sure that they're safe at work. So have the sanitizers, have policies that ensure that, all that incorporate the health measures that have been recommended by both the government and health institutions in order for you to be able to fulfill that particular duty under the Act. Number 3, if at all you need to change certain obligations, maybe the employment contracts provide for a place of work, but employees cannot be able to perform that. Maybe the employment contract requires the employee to travel to particular places in fulfilling their obligations. Ensure that at least enter into addendum contracts. Ensure that you enter into consent with employees if you are going to reduce their salaries before taking these particular measures. And of course, again, a disclaimer: always consult your legal advisor before taking any employment measure against your employees during this particular time. 3, they say that there are only 2 certain things in this life, and that's death and taxes. And therefore, during this particular time, all businesses, unless another directive is issued, they have an obligation to file their returns and they have an obligation to pay their taxes. However, the Tax Procedures Act has a number of provisions that may provide you with relief during this particular hard time. 1, submission of returns. The TPA, which is the Tax Procedures Act, allows you to write to the Commissioner of KRA to extend the time that you may be able to submit your tax return in order not to accrue penalties. So if you're filing monthly returns, and that's VAT, pay, withholding tax, if you are unable to file these returns, please apply in writing 15 days before the due date to the Commissioner of KRA. If you're filing the annual returns, and these are the corporate tax returns, ensure that you at least send your request for extension of time within 30 days or at least 30 days before the due date. Number 2, payment of taxes. April is a very, very important month for the tax man with respect to corporate tax, since corporate tax in Kenya is administered through the installment method. And April is when most businesses are required to pay their taxes, their first installment corporate tax. Now, you may not be in a position to do this because either of human resource challenges or operational challenges. You can rely on the Tax Procedures Act and ask in writing to the Commissioner of KRA for an extension of time to pay your taxes. But there's a disclaimer in that the Tax Procedures Act states that yes, you might be given leeway to extend the time for paying your taxes, but the late payment interest will still accrue from the original date. And therefore, make sure that you put that disclaimer when you're writing to the KRA and when you are discussing your board decisions. Number 4, data protection. Now we have a Data Protection Act in Kenya that requires data controllers and data processors to comply with certain things. Now, either as an employer or as a business, there's probably certain information that you collect about your employees or the people that you deal with. Although the Act states that you are exempted under what we call the public interest exemption, you are exempted from certain obligations of the Data Protection Act, that does not excuse you from complying with the data protection principles. So ensure that you have a privacy notice in place that informs the people that you are collecting their data, what you are collecting and what you are using the data for, and other requirements under that particular Act, and ensure that you review the data that you have in order to be able to comply with that. Last but not least, restricted trade practices. As a business, you may be inclined to make a profit during this crisis. You may be inclined to enter into different agreements with different people, different players in the market to either hike prices or to limit access or to limit production. Please know that some of these acts, and probably most of these acts, fall within what we call the restricted trade practices, and the competition watchdog or the competition authority of Kenya has the jurisdiction to investigate and take certain measures against you. And this is without saying the moral and ethical obligations of a business. These are turbulent times, but only the agile and resilient businesses are going to survive. So ensure that you consult your legal advisors on the issues that I have pointed out and any other issues that may affect or likely impact the future of your business, and take mitigating measures to ensure that you survive, that your employees still have work at the end of this crisis, and you turn out to be even a bigger and better business at the end of this crisis. Disclaimer: always consult your legal advisor for any of these issues, and everything that I have said here does not constitute legal advice.